Today we're going to begin reading in Genesis chapter 13, and it says, "So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, he and his wife and all that belonged to him, and Lot with him. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold. He went on his journeys from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there formerly. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, and the land could not sustain them while dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to remain together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. Now the Canaanite and the Perizzite were dwelling then in the land." Now, in this passage of Scripture are some interesting things geographically and that we can say about the relationships between brothers, believers, and how we ought to be, and how sometimes God deals in the lives of believers. But as we begin to look at this, I should say we're going to look at probably in this one lecture chapters 13 and chapters 14, which have a lot of very interesting material, particularly as we get to the end of chapter 14 and begin looking at this mysterious character of Melchizedek. But before we get too far from Egypt, which is where Abram is returning from, we should say something, because this is somewhat of an apologetic lecture series. We should point out that while Abram was in Egypt is the period of time during which the Mormons say that the book of Abraham was written. Now, you may be asking, what is the book of Abraham? Well, the book of Abraham is what the Mormons call this Egyptian text that fell into the hands of Joseph Smith in 1835. If you're not too familiar with Mormonism, Joseph Smith founded this religion after claiming that he had been visited by God the Father and Jesus. And the way that he describes this, he said he was very upset about the different religions or denominations of Christianity that were arguing amongst themselves during his childhood. And so at one point he decided that he was going to go out into the woods and pray. And so he did. He went out into the woods and he prayed. And when he prayed, it was the first time, he says, that he ever prayed verbally. And so when he did pray verbally, he asked God to tell him which denomination he should be a part of. And like a column of light appeared over his head. And God the Father and Jesus appeared to him from that column, and they began to tell him about what he should do. Specifically, they told him that he should not join any of the religions. In fact, it says, this is what he said about it. "After I had retired to the place where I had previously designed to go, having looked around me and finding myself alone, I kneeled down and began to offer up the desires of my heart to God. I had scarcely done so when immediately I was seized upon by some power which entirely overcame me, and had such an astonishing influence over me as to bind my tongue so that I could not speak. Thick darkness gathered around me, and it seemed to me for a time as if I were doomed to sudden destruction. But exerting all my power to call upon God to deliver me out of the power of this enemy which had seized upon me, and at the very moment when I was ready to sink into despair and abandon myself to destruction, not to an imaginary ruin, but to the power of some actual being from the unseen world, who had such marvelous power as I had never before felt in any being. Just at this moment of great alarm, I saw a pillar of light exactly over my head, above the brightness of the sun, which descended gradually until it fell upon me. It no sooner appeared than I found myself delivered from the enemy which held me bound. When the light rested upon me, I saw two personages, whose brightness and glory defy all description, standing above me in the air. One of them spake unto me, calling me by name, and said, pointing to the other, This is my beloved Son, hear him. My object in going to inquire of the Lord was to know which of all the sects was right, that I might know which to join. No sooner, therefore, did I get possession of myself so as to be able to speak than I asked the personages who stood above me in the light, which of all the sects was right, and which I should join. I was answered that I must join none of them, for they were all wrong. And the personage who addressed me said that they draw near to me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They teach for doctrines the commandments of men, having a form of godliness, but they deny the power thereof. Now, Smith goes on to tell how he ran back to tell everyone about this, or tell his mother about it, and she didn't believe him. And a few days later, a Methodist preacher told him that this sort of thing doesn't happen, these visions aren't from God, and so on and so forth. However, moving forward, today, this story is in a hymn that the Mormon Church sings called "Oh, How Lovely Was the Morning." And I'll just read a section of it here. "Oh, how lovely was the morning, radiant beamed the sun above. Bees were humming, sweet birds singing, music ringing through the grove. When within the shady woodland Joseph sought the God of love." And it goes on from there. So Joseph Smith founded the Mormon religion. This is not a class on Mormonism. However, I should just say that they have in the Mormon church, in the Mormon religion, 4 sacred texts. They have the Bible, the King James Bible, they say, so far as it is translated correctly. The Book of Mormon. So they have the Bible, the Book of Mormon. They have the Doctrines and Covenants, which contain revelations mostly from Joseph Smith. And then they have what is called Pearls of Great Price. That is their 4th of the standard texts. Now, the Pearls of Great Price contain the Book of Abraham. Now, the book, so what happened was, Joseph Smith, if you don't know his history, was a treasure hunter. I mean, he and his father had dug up most of the area in which they lived, most of the farm they lived on. They used divining rods and seer stones and all this sort of thing. The Mormon Church denies this now, but it's a historical fact. So they were always looking for some historical artifact that would just make them wealthy and had some supernatural influence or whatever. Well, Joseph Smith claimed to have found that in the Book of Abraham, also with the golden plates that became the Book of Mormon. But he had the Book of Abraham, which was a Egyptian text, legitimately was, that a traveling salesman was carrying through. And Joseph Smith purchased this in 1835 and took that text and claimed that he had translated it. Now, what's important to know is that at that time, Egyptology was not a very well-developed or well-known discipline and area of study in this area where Joseph Smith lived. However, toward the end of the 1800s, the beginning of the 1900s, there were this kind of experienced a revival or some renewed enthusiasm, and people were taking trips to Egypt and all that sort of thing. And so we were able to look and see what this quote-unquote Book of Abraham, this Egyptian text, actually said. And it has to do with funerary practices in Egypt. It doesn't have anything to do with Abraham. It's not anything that calls itself the Book of Abraham or by any stretch of the imagination could be connected with Abraham. It just has to do with funerary practices in ancient Egypt. This is a known fraud. You say, well, how do we know all that's true? Because the Book of Abraham, though lost and damaged during the Chicago fire, we now know what the Book of Abraham looks like. We have images of it. We have all the information we need to figure out what it says. So now we know it doesn't say anything like what Joseph Smith said that it said. This is a huge embarrassment for Mormonism. And I know you're probably thinking right now, why are we talking so much about Mormonism? Well, I'm going to tell you in just a second because it's connected with this passage. But what they try to say is they say, well, their answer now, all of their answers are horrible. And Mormon apologetics, and by that I do not mean apologists who are focused on reaching Mormons, but rather Mormons who are doing apologetics in defense of Mormonism. They have a whole website just devoted just for this that's sponsored by the church. And their answers to this are terrible, as are their answers to most things that they try to give in defense of Mormonism. And their answer to this, they have a couple. One answer is that, well, okay, it's not really what it is there's just a couple of images of the book in the Book of Abraham text that Joseph Smith had a special supernatural ability to discern. He got a revelation. So the major body of what we might call text, so to speak, of Egyptian images, that doesn't have anything to do with the Book of Abraham. But there's a couple of images on there that Smith was able to supernaturally get a revelation from. Of course, this is not in the least bit falsifiable. There's no way to look and see, and because he's just basically saying, well, it just means that because they're saying it just means that because he looked and God gave him a message. In which case, the book of Abraham, quote unquote, the text that we call the book of Abraham, is immaterial to the whole discussion because he's just getting it by revelation. So that's just ad hoc, Then the second thing would be they say, well, there's portions of it that are burnt or missing, and it was on those portions that the book of Abraham would have. But this is obvious to anyone else that it's just stretching. And even if some section of the book of Abraham, of what we call the book of Abraham text, even if there are sections that are missing, it would make no sense to then say that this whole conversation moved from a very practical discussion of the dead and all that sort of thing in Egypt to what we have in the quote-unquote book of Abraham that is in Pearls of Great Price. So this is really just making stuff up, and there's no reason to pay much attention to it. It's a huge embarrassment to Mormonism. However, during this period of time when the Bible says in Genesis chapter 12, and here at the beginning of 13, that Abram was in Egypt, that is the period of time when Mormons believe that he wrote the book of Abraham, or that the book of Abraham was written. So when you think about this or come to this passage, when you're talking with a Mormon, maybe you could point out that there's just absolutely no reason we should trust the book of Abraham. All right, and so it says he went up from Egypt to the Negev. This is the southern region there. We discussed that in the last lecture. He, his wife, and all he had, and Lot with him. Abram was very rich in livestock, silver, and gold. He went by stages from the Negev to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had formerly been, to the site where he had built the altar, and Abram worshipped the Lord there. If you take the position, as I do, that the previous chapter represents some missteps on Abram's part, which I don't see, again, as I said last time, I don't see any reason to doubt that. Abram is a godly man. We all should be able to respect Abram, not just Jews, but we should all look to Abraham as an example of faithfulness. The Bible tells us that elsewhere and even in the New Testament. Nevertheless, he's a man, and the Bible is very realistic with its heroes, and he made some mistakes. And if you take the most plain reading of the last chapter to mean that he messed up by going all the way down to Egypt, then we see here a little bit of a devotional point. And I don't want you to take from my meaning here that I think the Bible is actually trying to teach this to us here. Although, as is the case with the historical narratives that we have in the Bible, we can often learn some very good principles by how God deals with people and how people perform that are true and are good for our spiritual lives as well. Here we see Abram going back to where he had previously, rightly, and in the will of God, built an altar. There have been times in my life, I'm sure there have been times in your life, where you feel like you got off track, where you feel like you stepped out of God's will and were no longer walking with God or doing things the way that God would ultimately prefer you to do them. I remember that when I first left pastoring in 2005, or early 2006, I should say, I knew, as much as I could know anything, though I had even lied to myself about it, that I was meant to move at that point to Evansville, Indiana, because my future would be involved with Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary. But I didn't move to Evansville at that time. Instead, I did what I would prefer personally to do. I wanted to live in Nashville, Tennessee. Nashville was a special place for me. I had met my wife in the Nashville area, gone to school there. That had been my home growing up from age 10 years old to about 20 years old. And so I wanted to live in Nashville again, rather than move to Evansville. But I now looking back, I know that I was lying to myself, because I know that I felt even then at certain times that I really should go on to Evansville and not stop in Nashville. But I stayed in Nashville, and it was easy to rationalize. I felt like, hey, there's nothing intrinsically sinful about being in Nashville, Tennessee. Nashville's not that bad of a place. And in fact, all the major interstates, come through Nashville there in Tennessee. And so if I'm going to be traveling and speaking, doing evangelism and apologetics, well, Nashville would be a much more sensible place to live than to live in Evansville, Indiana. And so it just made a lot of sense, and I was able to rationalize it to myself that way. I lived in Nashville for 2 years with my wife, and then it became clear that God had applied some pressure, and it was time for us to move on to Evansville, Indiana, where we currently still live. During the time that I was living there in Nashville, I believe that I was somewhat, not ministerially, but in terms of where I lived geographically, I was out of the will of God. I was not doing what God would have me to do ultimately. And that became very clear. It affected me financially. It affected my marriage. It affected me in a lot of different ways. And once I moved on to Evansville, I could already begin to experience the peace that I was where God wanted me to be. And I believe that God has blessed that decision to get back on track. What I ultimately had to do was to go back to where I had last built an altar, which was in Evansville. I had known earlier that my future was at Trinity, but I had gone off course and lived in Nashville, and I knew that I needed to go back to that altar, so to speak. I needed to go back to where I knew God wanted me to be, and I needed to stay there. Now, when I say go back, I didn't live in Evansville previous to that, but I'd been there, and I knew that's where God wanted me to be. I had, so to speak, built an altar there. And so I had to go back to that altar and get on track. And in your own personal life, there are times when you have likely been out of the will of God. Often when I preach, I say, how many of you can point to a time like that where you did something that you knew God really didn't want you to do, and ultimately it turned out horribly for you as a result? And I tell them to raise their hands, and almost every hand in the house goes up. And it's because that's a part of the human experience, because we're not perfect. And when that happens, the best thing to do is to say, okay, well, where did I go off track? Where did I last rightly build an altar in the promised land God had for me? I'm going to go back to that place. I'm going to pick up where I left off. Sometimes it's difficult to see how you can go back to that altar. Maybe a marriage ended in a way that was not biblical, and now you have moved on, and you can't go back to that marriage because that other person has married someone else. And you say, well, how can I possibly go back to the altar? I think then the best way of thinking about it, this is just my own personal opinion, is go as close to that altar as you possibly can and continue on from there. And this is what we see Abram doing. Abram had that bad experience down there in Egypt, and he went back to where he had previously built that altar, and he continued on from that point. Now, next we see that the strife begins between Lot and Abram's herdsmen. Now, what is this all about? What's going on here? Well, first of all, what we need to understand is that at that point, both of these men had what amounted to little nations going around at the time. You know, you may recall that we were talking about in a previous lecture that in this area, in this Canaanite region, there were all of these kingdoms, but what these kingdoms amounted to were like little cities. And there was a king, he was almost like what we think of as the mayor of that city. That's really a more appropriate way to think of it than to think of these vast nations of people like, America or something. That really wasn't what it was like. It was like a little city. And Abram at this point, and Lot both had their own little city. They both had their own little herdsmen. We know that these are numerous peoples because we find out later in chapter 14 that Abram himself has a large number of men. Verse 14 says that Abram had 318 men that were trained for, we'll talk about that when we get there, something. But he had that many men just trained for, that he could use, that he could rely on for combat. That's not counting other people that were doing other things. So these people were like little nations. And in a region like they had there, you had these herdsmen. It specifies these herdsmen for a reason, is because it's very difficult to have enough land and enough area, especially if you're close together like that, for all of the herds to have enough places to graze and enough to eat and all these kinds of things. So for these herdsmen to get upset with each other, it didn't just mean they didn't get along very well. This was about survival. And when survival is in view, emotions can get impassioned very, very quickly, because when you're talking about survival, it gets very serious. If you ever watched one of these reality TV shows where they have limited supplies, and even though they have a TV crew, and if something really bad were to happen, they could supply them with food and everything else, There have been episodes of certain programs where these people have lost 40, 50 pounds during the course of the show, and in a given episode, they have to be life-flighted out of the area. But when those reserves go down, when those rations go down, people get very angry, they get very irritable, they get aggravated with each other because you have these instincts for survival that have to be satisfied. And so we see here that these herdsmen are at odds with each other. Although it also mentions here that the Canaanite and the Perizzite were dwelling then in the land. Now, if Moses wrote this, I should say, if Moses wrote this as we take it that he did, the Canaanite and the Perizzite were still living in the land during his day. Some have pointed this as an evidence that Moses didn't write this because they would say, well, someone wrote this at a period of time when the Canaanite and the Perizzite were not in the land. Otherwise, they wouldn't feel compelled to write the Canaanite and the Perizzite were then in the land, as if they used to be in the land. Back then they were in the land, but they're not in the land now. However, this could just as easily be read, and a lot of commentators write it this way. The authors of the Apologetics study Bible that Holman puts out point this out, and so do a lot of others, that it could just as easily mean even back then they were in the land, as if to say they're in the land now, but just to be clear, they were in the land even back then. There's also another explanation that I think I mentioned in the very first lecture of all of these lectures in this study, is that it could be that even if you took it to mean the first option, that they're not in the land now, but they were back then, that could have been an editorial comment that is put into the text later on. You see, in order to believe that Moses wrote this, you don't have to believe that Moses wrote every last jot and tittle of the book of Genesis, because you could have commentary or little points that are added later. For example, when we get to chapter 14, we're going to see that it makes reference to Dan. Well, Dan wasn't called Dan at that point, and wouldn't be called Dan until much later. However, it's likely that that this was that whatever term Moses used, that Dan was then substituted later on by some scribe for greater clarity for those readers at that point. So there's really no reason to doubt. People that want to point to things like this to doubt that Moses was the author have just already decided ahead of time that Moses is not the author, and now they're looking for things like this as evidence, but there's really no reason to think that that's the case. I mean, even now when we're writing history, if we look back to someone who wrote a history of America from, the 1700s or the 1800s or something like that, we will put little commentary notes in the history to make clear to future readers what he was talking about. That community over there is now called this, or this area was not a state at that time, now it's a state, and it's the state of whatever. So we do that even now. To speak as though they couldn't do that then is just reveals a presupposition that Moses is not the author already, which is problematic. Another thing we could say about Canaanite and Perizzite, it could be that that these peoples were causing problems that provoked these herdsmen to have issues with each other. What could likely be the possibility, and this certainly makes for good preaching for preachers that are taking notes here, it's possible that the Bible records that the Canaanite and the Perizzite were then in the land because it wants to make it clear to us, the reader, or to Moses' readers rather, that this was a bad example to the Canaanites and the Perizzites that were there. The Canaanites and the Perizzites there at the time did not need to be seeing God's people, represented by Abram and his group, and Lot and his group, arguing and in disunity with each other. And that's what the reason why it says that. Because then, of course, verse 8 says, "So Abram said to Lot, 'Please let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brothers.'" Okay, so it certainly seems like just on the heels of saying that the Canaanite and the Perizzite were in the land, then Abram saying this, that the point is to say we don't need this bad example in front of these pagans of disunity among God's people. It doesn't make God look good. We don't want to bring shame on God. We want to bring honor to God in the eyes of men. Now, notice also that it does say in verse 8 that we are brothers. Some who are not very biblically knowledgeable would say, well, now hold on a second. This doesn't make any sense. There is clearly here a problem in the text. There's a contradiction here because it says here that they are brothers. Whereas we know from chapter 11 of the book of Genesis that Lot is the son of Haran, which is Abram's brother. So Lot is Abram's nephew. So some people have seen what they thought is a contradiction here in this passage. I don't see it as a contradiction. I don't see a problem here at all, because we know that the Hebrew word "ach" is sometimes translated brother, but it really just refers to a relative or someone you have a close relationship with. And of course, that's even how we use the term today. We'll say, hey, brother, or something. Obviously, we use that in the church, in the religious context, and we do mean siblings in Christ. But you would also use it with someone, some people would use it of someone of their own nationality or whatever. We use the term brother that way even today. We're brothers. But it just refers to a close relationship or a close bond or something like that. And that's how Abram means it here. Anybody who at all looks into this with any level of academic interest would see that this is not at all a contradiction. You got to give the authors of the book of Genesis some credit for having some modicum of intelligence. I mean, they're not going to contradict so obviously something from just a few pages earlier. And we know, but on top of that, we know that term can be used that way. It doesn't. There's just absolutely no reason to be concerned about a possible contradiction here about who Lot was in the story. It's just made so clear for us. All right, so verse 9 says, "Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If to the left, then I will go to the right. Or if to the right, then I will go to the left." Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that all the valley of the Jordan, that is well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go to Zoar. So Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the valley, and moved his tents as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly, and sinners against the Lord. All right, now this is a place. This is toward the south end of what is now the Dead Sea, is where Lot has gone. Abram went about midway across the region that we now know of as Israel toward the coast. About midway across would be where he landed, and this was the area where he decided to live and set up his camp, and Lot's over there. And this really shows some faithfulness on Abram's part. He has learned his lesson now. Here he puts his entire future, his entire fate, so to speak, in the hands of Lot, or in the hands of God by virtue of putting it in the hands of Lot. Because he said to Lot, you go wherever you want to go, and the subtext is, I'm going to trust God to take care of me no matter what you choose, I'll go the other way. This is a man who I believe has experienced some change. Now, it tells us here in verse 13 that it gives us here what could be a little bit of foreshadowing. Now, the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly and sinners against the Lord. That tells us something about what is coming ahead, because ahead we know that we're going to see Lot get into some trouble in chapter 14. And this goes ahead and tells you that this is not a good thing. Now, it's interesting. When I've asked people, in preparing to record this today, I've asked several people who are biblically knowledgeable. I said, all right, now you've got 2 seconds to answer this question after I ask it. And I don't want you to think too much about it. I just want you to answer quickly. Was Lot, when you think about Lot, do you think about a person, do you have positive feelings or do you have negative feelings? And with the exception of one person, everyone else said negative feelings. And then as soon as they answered, they thought about it and said, well, I guess I say that because of things that we know about Lot, like, choosing this area for himself, being surrounded by the wicked people in Sodom, what we know happens with his daughters in virtue of the angels being there and offering his daughters, and what his daughters do to him later, and all these kinds of things. We have these negative feelings about Lot. But we have to remember that the Bible says about Lot that he's a righteous man. Now, of course, that doesn't mean a categorical endorsement of everything that Lot does. But we have to balance out what we think about Lot when we consider things like this. 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 7 says, "And if he rescued righteous Lot, oppressed by the sensual conduct of unprincipled men." So Peter tells us that Lot was righteous. This has bothered a whole lot of people, how this man who is so wicked could be righteous. But it's not our place to stand in judgment. I remember my father used to preach all the time. He'd say, sometimes I disagree with God, but ultimately God's right and I'm wrong. On the one hand, Moses doesn't get to go into the promised land because of one little mistake that he makes, or what seems like a little mistake to us. Well, I disagree with God about that, but he's right and I'm wrong. David's a man after God's own heart after he arranges for Uriah to be killed, and then after he has had an affair with Bathsheba and all that. He's a man after God's own heart. I disagree with God about that, but ultimately it doesn't matter what you and I think about these things. It matters ultimately what God thinks. And it says here in the Word of God through an inspired author, Peter, that Lot was a righteous man. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to you and I, but apparently it makes sense to God, and that's ultimately what matters. Now, we need to say something else here about the fact that, again, Abraham has had something taken away from him. Abram has had he's had to leave his homeland. He's had his father died, and he had to then so he's left his father behind, and he's had a lot of things taken, and now he's having Lot taken away. I mean, talk about being set apart. But this is a part of the Christian life. We are people who are set apart, and you are set often against your family, even as Jesus promised might happen. And so we are a people who are separated. When I was growing up the son of a pastor. And so for that reason, there were certain people that, at least when they first met me, they felt like they really couldn't, friends that were in the church, even at a young age, they felt like they really couldn't be themselves around me or say certain things. And as I became a teenager, people that would, use foul language or whatever, they would say, "Oh, well, Braxton's here now, we can't talk that way." And I kind of was used to that. However, my wife, in being married now to a minister and to a seminarian, she has often pointed out that it's hard to make friends. It's hard to keep friends for very long. It's even where we live right now, we live in a strip of houses, and people on either side of us are church members. And they all go to the same church. The people to the left of our house, to the two houses down, and the house right across the street on the right, they all go to the same church. But it's always been a little bit difficult for her to become close friends with those other women because she feels that she can't really kind of let her hair down, so to speak, with those people. And she feels like they are kind of a little bit afraid to be around her too much or to act comfortably around her because of the feeling that, well, she's probably going to be judgmental because, we're not, she's a minister's wife and they are very active and they homeschool their kids and they're always talking about the gospel and all those sort of things. Now, in some cases, that might be just an assumption that is made about them. However, in at least one case out of those three homes, she's been told this. And even where it's an assumption, it's an assumption based on prior experience. Sadly, even when I pastored, though we had good friends in the church, there was a little bit of a distance between them because of this very reason. And sometimes it costs you friends. Sometimes something will happen and your friends you'll have then a division between you and those friends. I have friends from high school that I now am not friends with, and it's not by virtue of my choice. It's because they made that choice. They chose that a lifestyle or a certain worldview that is at odds with the worldview that I hold and that we as a family hold. And they know that occasionally, usually because they bring it up, that will get discussed, and that makes them uncomfortable. We have friends from when we did live in Nashville that don't see the world quite the same way we do, even those who claim to be Christians and may well be Christians, but they're seeing the world differently. And in a stark contrast exists. And so for that reason, they've been cut off from us now. And it has driven a wedge in our relationships. And so for all of these reasons, what Abram experiences here is not unlike the experience that a lot of church people have and Christian people have who endeavor to really live for the Lord. And, all of this makes me sound really good in our family, like we're so holier and more righteous. I'm not. We make mistakes all of the time. But the reality is that sometimes God removes from you people that you care about, places that you care about, things that matter to you. Ultimately, perhaps because He wants you to rely completely on Him. For all of your needs to be met. We'll see that again here in just a little while toward the end of chapter 14, whenever people are trying to give things to Abraham and he doesn't take it because he wants to rely completely on God. When Solomon was made king, he was not meant, the Israelite kings were not supposed to multiply horses and all of these kind of things because their victories and their success and their prosperity was supposed to be a testimony that God did this for them. And if you multiply horses for combat purposes, and if people give you wealth that, from outside, pagan people are giving you wealth and this sort of thing, it kind of does give the impression that your wealth, your prosperity, the way you're taken care of all comes from outside of God and comes from others, when really it's supposed to come from God. So we want to keep all of these things in mind. And so in that way, we see in what happens with Abram and Lot here a real testimony to what does happen oftentimes with people who are trying to live for the Lord. Verse 14 says, "The Lord said to Abram after Lot had separated from him, 'Now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are northward and southward, eastward and westward. For all the land which you see, I will give it to you and to your descendants forever. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be numbered. Arise, walk about the land, through its length and breadth, for I will give it to you.' Then Abram moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and where he built an altar. And there he built an altar to the Lord." Okay, now this is some more detailed information about the promise that God has made to Abram back in chapter 12. Now, what we want to notice here is he tells him to go up and down through the land and back and forth and to walk through this whole thing. You say, well, that sounds like a lot of work. Why is God saying it this way? Well, this scholars and historians understand to be similar to an ancient land grant treaty. This is in the form, this is the kind of phraseology that went into land grants. Now, elsewhere, God makes arrangements between His people and Himself that are in the form of a suzerain treaty. And you might want to take a look at suzerainty treaties or suzerainty arrangements or covenants. Because think about it this way. Have you ever heard it said by preachers or in reading a book about the Bible that during the first century, during Jesus' lifetime, Israel was a vassal nation under Rome? That Rome had put in a vassal king, and so even though Israel was its own nation or its own land, it still had an overarching rulership in Rome. Well, in that sense, in that case, they were a vassal state under a suzerain, and Rome was the suzerain. So there was an agreement there that we're going to let you have a king, we're going to let you have this land, we're going to let you function somewhat according to your own laws and your own religion and all that sort of thing. But we really stand over you, sovereign over you as the suzerain. This is why when Jesus was taken, they had to go back and forth between Pilate and the priests in Israel, because there was this uncertainty about how this all should be handled because of this vassal suzerain relationship with Rome and Israel. Who really gets to make the call here? Well, some stuff in the Old Testament, some places where promises are made from God and arrangements are spoken about by God, particularly when we get into Exodus, we're going to see what scholars believe to be a suzerainty treaty or a suzerainty covenant or relationship, rather, between God and Israel, that God is the suzerain and Israel is the vassal. And so Israel is allowed to have a king. They're allowed to function. They've got these laws, but ultimately there is a sovereign who is in control over them, that being God. Okay, so that's why they can have a king, but ultimately God is king. God's ultimately the one with the authority here. Well, I point all of that out because you're going to read some people talk about these suzerainty treaties, but I want you to see that this is considered by some scholars to be in the form of an ancient land grant. And the suzerainty treaty is meant to protect the rights of the suzerain, the one who is ultimately the sovereign in control. The land grant is meant to protect the rights of the one who's getting the land. So God is making this promise to them. And he says in verse 15 that he will give it to you and to your descendants. Now, remember, we said before that descendants is probably not the best word there. It should be seed. And in Galatians, Paul says that seed is Jesus. So there are some interesting theological elements there that hinge on that word, descendants or seed. And the word is ambiguous as to whether it should be singular or plural, but it's to your seed forever. And so did God give it to them forever? Well, interestingly, ultimately Israel was driven out of the land, and then now they're back in the land. And so if you take one theological perspective, it would lead you to say, well, see, God gave them that land, so they're always going to be able to come back to that land, and it's wrong right now for that land to be divided up with Palestine or anybody else, because that's land that was promised to Abram and his descendants, plural. If you take it to be singular and you go with where Paul says that seed is Christ, you say, well, it's not necessarily that land belongs to genetic descendants of Abraham, but it belongs to the seed, Christ. And really, the whole world belongs in that sense to Christ. So you see a lot goes into that. So did he give it to them forever? Well, yes, but the question is, who did he give it to, and what do we understand about that? All right? Now, it says here that he's going to make of his descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be numbered. Arise, walk about the land through its length and breadth. Then Abram moved his tent and dwelt in the oaks of Mamre. Now, Mamre, we find out later, is a man, and the oaks are named there for him. They belong to Mamre, or did, which are in Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. He's got his worship in order, okay? Now, that brings us to the end of chapter 13. We're going to go ahead and begin talking about chapter 14 now, so we're just going to keep on trucking. Okay, chapter 14, verse 1 says, "And it came about in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goim, that they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is, Zoar. All these came as allies to the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea." Okay, so this is the region where now we have the Dead Sea. We think that the Dead Sea was a lot smaller. It used to be a lot smaller than it is now. Some think that Sodom used to be in part of the area that is now covered by the Dead Sea. 12 years they had served Kedorlaomer, but the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year, Kedorlaomer and the kings that were with him came and defeated the Rephaim in Ashtoreth Karnaim, and the Zuzim in Ham, and the Emim in Sheva Kiratham, and the Horites in their mountain Seir, as far as El Paran, which is by the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is, Kadesh, and conquered all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites, who lived in Hazezon Tamar. And the king of Sodom, and the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is, Zoar, came out. And they arrayed for battle against them in the valley of Siddim, against Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goim, and Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Siddim was full of tar pits, and the king of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, and they fell into them. But those who survived fled to the hill country. Then they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food supply and departed. They also took Lot, Abram's nephew, and his possessions, and departed, for he was living in Sodom. Now, I need to say some things about this before we move on to the pertinent part of the story where Abram goes after Lot. And that is to say that we have some archaeological evidence for the truth or in the existence of some that are named here. According to E. Ray Clendenin, we know that what people used to do in ancient times, what kings used to do in Egypt, was if they wished ill upon some other king, some rival king, what they would do is they would write the name of that king on a clay pot or a statue, and then they would smash that pot, and while they're smashing the pot, they would pronounce some curse. Now, if you don't believe in superstitions, Egyptian superstitions, this just sounds like a horrible waste of fine pottery and statues. However, that's what they would do. They would write the name of this king and they would shatter it. And they might write the name of a place and shatter it. And this practice, what we call these pieces of pottery when we find them, because we found these pieces of pottery with names on them through archaeology, and we call these execration texts. And these execration texts we have dating from about the time of Joseph, so the 19th to 18th centuries, and their rulers considered at the time, which were enemies of the Egyptian state. And some of the towns are mentioned in the Bible. And this, of course, shows the authenticity of the biblical texts and the biblical account. And they verify that the cities were ruled at the time by some of these kings. And so here's an example of some of the towns that we've found on these, we verified through these execration texts. Akko in Judges 1:31 is mentioned. Aphek, Akshaph, Ashkelon, Beth Shean, Beth Shemesh, Bozrah, which is actually mentioned in Genesis chapter 36. And then in this very chapter, Damascus is mentioned in verse 15. And then in the next chapter, chapter 15, verse 2. And then Ekron, Laish, Midian, Migdal, Rahab, Shechem, which is also mentioned in the book of Genesis in chapter 12, verse 6, chapter 33, verse 18, and chapter 37, verses 12 through 14, and then Byblos and Jerusalem. All these places are mentioned, as well as a Hebrew word that is translated as trained in chapter 14, this chapter, and verse 14. There's a Hebrew word that is kanakim, and it's rendered trained, and it's found in the Bible only in Genesis 14:14. And it's also found in the execration text, which supports the credibility of the Genesis chapter 14 account. So I just say all of that by way of commenting on these kings and on these things that are going on here, that we have some archaeological evidence for the truth of some of these places and some of these kinds of things, okay? Now, it tells us, so look down in, let's see where we left off here. Look down in verse 13. It says, Then a fugitive came and told Abram the Hebrew, now he was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner. And these were allies with Abram. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he led out his trained men. There it is. That's that word. That is the Hebrew word that only shows up here. And it is, that's the word that I said was contained in the execration texts, and it is the word kanakim. All right? It's a Hebrew word. And so, picking up, it says that he's trained these men, born in his house, 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. We commented on that earlier. He divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them, and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. He brought back all the goods, and also brought back his relative Lot with his possessions, and also the women and the people. Okay, so now some scholars look at this story and they say this can't possibly have happened, because how could Abram have ever possibly been able to have this military conquest? Well, there are a couple of things we can say about this. One thing to be pointed out is that the Bible records miraculous stories like this already. In Judges chapter 7, verses 9 through 22, we know the story of Gideon and how Gideon pared down his army at God's command to 300. And this is, again, following the pattern that we discussed earlier in this lecture of God making sure that he receives glory for the military conquests that take place rather than man taking glory for it. I mean, if Gideon had a much larger army, well, then someone could say, well, he just was able to do this because of all the swords and all the combat and all the, he had the soldiers for this to carry out this military exploit. But if you pare it down to 300, well, there's just no way of getting around it. God must have given him this victory. That may well be what's going on here, because we certainly see that toward the end of this chapter. If you look down at Genesis chapter 14 and verse 21, we see it says, "The king of Sodom said to Abram, 'Give the people to me, and take the goods for yourself.' Abram said to the king of Sodom, 'I have sworn to the Lord God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread or a sandal thong or anything that is yours, for fear you would say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing except what the young men have eaten, and the share of the men who went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them take their share.'" So it's clear here that the point is that no one would be able to say that these pagans made Abram rich. Rather, it was God that made Abram rich. It was God that delivered. It was God that receives ultimate glory for all of these things. Okay, so we want to keep all of that in consideration. So when we come back to consider how it is that Abram could possibly have conquered these other kings, well, there is one very clear possibility, and that is that this just shows the glory of God. I mean, look, if you don't believe that Abram could do it with God at the helm, so to speak, well, then, if you don't believe the Bible, don't believe the Bible. I say that quite frequently. But if you're going to believe that anything about this story that contains a lot of supernatural elements and talks about God and his sovereignty and his control, if you think all of that is possible, then to say that God enabled Abram to do this it's not reaching. I mean, this is small potatoes for a God who could speak the universe into existence, right? So I don't see a problem there. I just don't see a consideration. However, it could also be the case that there's nothing supernatural going on here, but rather that these people who were coming back from a lot of activity already were now, worn out. They weren't expecting this, and they were kind of easy pickings. Besides which, we know that Abram had 318 trained men. Now, what does it mean to say that they were trained? Were they trained for combat? Well, that certainly seems to be the impression that it gives us here in verse 14. It says, when Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he led out his trained men, born in his house, 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. Now, you don't have to think that Abram trained these men with the intent of doing violence. It could well be that he trained these men for the purposes of self-defense. On the one hand, we can say, well, yeah, God's going to handle everything. God's going to control everything. God's going to take care of you. But God does not exclude our making some human preparation. After the walls of Jericho came tumbling down, miraculously by the power of God, the first thing that Joshua does is to send spies out to Ai. That's perfectly fine, because even if you're trusting God, there's still no reason to think that you can't also strategize and think, I like the old adage that says, pray like it all depends on God, and work like it all depends on you. The only correction I would make there is pray, because it does all depend on God, and work as though it all depended on you. I think that's a good philosophy, and that's, of course, what we see Joshua doing. I think that's what we see Abram doing in having these trained men. So if he had 318 trained men, and they were prepared for this, and these men, these opposing armies, were worn out from their previous struggle, then it's really not that much of a leap to think that he could overtake them. So whether you think that's the solution or just that God miraculously did this to him, there's really no problem, and it's really not outlandish either way, okay? So we can understand all of that. Now let's take a look at the next thing that really interests us, which is this mysterious figure called Melchizedek. All right, look down at verse 17 of Genesis 14. And verse 17 says, "Then after his return from the defeat of Kedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Sheveh." That is the king's valley. Now notice something here. It says the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet with him in the valley of Sheveh, the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High. He blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." He gave him a tenth of all. The king of Sodom said to, and then we go into what the king of Sodom said. We talked about that already. Who is this mysterious figure, Melchizedek? We've already commented on the verses that come after the story of Melchizedek here, so we're going to spend the rest of our time talking here about this king Melchizedek, okay? So let's talk about this. Melchizedek is mysterious to a lot of people because this is not the only place we hear of him. Now, what we hear in this story is that he is the king of Salem. He comes out and he brings bread and wine, and that Abram pays him a tithe, gives him a tenth. That's really all we know about Melchizedek based on the account in Genesis. If that were the end of the story, we might not have much else to say, but that's not the end of the story. In Psalm 110, Psalm chapter 110, and verse 4, we find that it says, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek." Now, who is this being said about or to? Well, this is a Psalm of David, and it's considered to be messianic. This is, you know that you've heard this many times because it tells us in Psalm 110, verse 1, "The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet." This is considered to be a messianic psalm, virtually by all Christians. And so when he says down here to this messianic figure, that in verse 4, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek." This is a very strange thing because what is David even talking about here? I mean, if we didn't have further revelation, where did David get this? At the time David wrote this, Israel had a priestly system, the Levites. They didn't have a priesthood in the order of Melchizedek. They had a priesthood in the order of the Levites. So why is he talking here about Melchizedek? What does he know about Melchizedek that we do not know? Really the only way he would be able to get this information and it be relevant is by revelation. But this is not the last place that the Bible speaks of Melchizedek. Some of you who have already studied this in great deal already know that over in the book of Hebrews, if you go to the book of Hebrews and you go to Hebrews chapter 5, we see Melchizedek showing up again. Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 5 says, "In the same way, the Messiah did not exalt himself to become a high priest, but the one who said to him, 'You are my son. Today I have become your father,' also said in another passage, 'You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek.' During his earthly life, he offered prayers and appeals with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Though a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. After he was perfected, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obeyed him, and he was declared by God a high priest in the order of Melchizedek." Okay, so now this author of Hebrews is now introducing in again this character of Melchizedek. And then we go over to chapter 6, or we go over to, chapter 6, in verse 20, where it says, "Jesus has entered there on our behalf as a forerunner, because he has become a high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." Okay, so now we've got David saying that that this messianic figure would be a priest in the order of Melchizedek. Then we find here the author of Hebrews giving us more information. Now, high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Now, who is this character of Melchizedek? Well, we see a break in talking about Melchizedek in chapter 6, but till the end of chapter 6, because the author didn't feel like his hearers would be ready to hear much about Melchizedek. In the end of chapter 5 and for almost all of chapter 6, he's telling them, I wish I could tell you more about this character of Melchizedek. In verse 11 of chapter 5, he says, we have a great deal to say about this, but it's difficult to explain since you have become slow to understand. He's chiding them and saying, I'd like to tell you more about Melchizedek. There's a lot I have to say, but I can't tell you about this because you're not ready to hear it. But then in chapter 7, he picks up and does tell us more. He says, for this Melchizedek, verse 1, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham and blessed him as he returned from defeating the kings. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. First, his name means king of righteousness. Then also king of Salem, meaning king of peace. Now, the reason he says this is because Salem is where we get the word shalom, and it just means peace. So even in Genesis, when it says he's the king of Salem, it could just as well, like the author of Hebrews as an inspired writer reveals to us is the case, could just as well be saying that he's the king of peace. He's the king of peace. Now, some have tried to argue that he was the king of Jerusalem. However, Jerusalem was experiencing Jebusite rule, and they were wicked Canaanites, so this can't be the king of the Jebusite city of Jerusalem at the time. And it can't, others have tried to say, some Jewish tradition says that this is Shem, because Shem would have still been alive at this time. Shem, Ham, and Japheth, sons of Noah, that this is Shem, through whom all of the Jews came out of Shem. But it's unlikely that this is Shem, because there's just no good reason to believe that it would be Shem. It says here he's the king of Salem. And the author of Hebrews tells us that means he was the king of peace. All right? And then verse 3 says, without father, mother, or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of days, but resembling the Son of God. Now, some would say about this, well, okay, this just means that the Bible doesn't give us a genealogy for Melchizedek, where elsewhere it gives us genealogies for a lot of other people. All this is saying that he doesn't have a beginning of days or ending of days, mother or father. It's just saying it doesn't tell us what his genealogy is. But, of course, while that's possible, why would that be noteworthy at all? I mean, after all, there are a lot of biblical characters that we don't have genealogies for. So why would that be noteworthy? Why would the author of Hebrews think it important to tell us that, to point out that we see no beginning of days nor end of days? It seems like he's drawing a parallel with what he says next, resembling the Son of God, like the Son of God. How is he like the Son of God? Well, that he has no beginning of days nor end of days. How is he like the Son of God? Well, because he has no mother and no earthly mother, no father. Obviously, Jesus, the Son of God, had an earthly mother, and God the Father we refer to as his Father, God the Father. But in terms of genetics, in terms of genetic lineage, we teach the pre-existence of Christ. We believe that the Bible gives us the pre-existence of Christ. And in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So in that sense, he has no father, he has no mother, he has no beginning of days, he has no end of days, he is eternal. And the author of Hebrews seems to be saying Melchizedek was like that. Now, what kind of a character could be like that? Well, if you think that it's just telling us there's no genealogy for him, and that in this way he kind of serves as a type of Christ, just as Adam serves as a type of Christ, or Joseph serves as a type of Christ. Melchizedek, this priest, this obscure priest in Genesis 14, serves as a type of Christ. And if you think that that's all that means, that it doesn't give us his genealogy, well, you could just go with a typology. And maybe that's the case. Certainly a lot of scholars think that way. However, I'm convinced otherwise. And the reason that I'm convinced otherwise has to do with not only what's been said already here, but then what he goes on to say next. It says, now, consider how great this man, well, it says, first of all, that he remains a priest forever. Now, if he remains a priest forever, then that means that he is currently, at the time Hebrews is being authored, still a priest. Now, how could this man, if all it means in telling us that he has no beginning of days nor end of days, no mother and father, if all that means is we don't know what his genealogy is, but he was a man like any other man, and he lived and died like any other man, how could he still be a priest forever? That doesn't seem to make much sense, does it? How could he still be a priest at the time of this writing of Hebrews, right? And how could it be that he's a priest forever if he's just a normal man, right? It seems that he's an everlasting man. In fact, everlasting doesn't go so far as to say it. He is a pre-existing and eternal man. It seems like that's what it's saying. Look at what it says in verse 4. Now consider how great this man was, to whom even Abraham the patriarch gave a tenth of the plunder. Now, this seems to imply that the author of Hebrews thinks that this man is really great. When, if you study the book of Hebrews prior to this chapter 7, you'll see that the theme that the author wants to impress is that there are all these other biblical characters, there are even the angels, and no one is better than Christ. You know, you have these people, think about how great they are. Well, they're not better than Jesus. Jesus is greater than they are. Nevertheless, you come here, and we don't get that treatment. What we get as, think about how great this character, Melchizedek, is. All right? Verse 5 says, the sons of Levi who receive the priestly office have a commandment according to the law to collect a tenth from the people, that is, from their brothers, though they have also descended from Abraham. But one without this lineage collected tithes from Abraham and blessed the one who had the promises. Without a doubt, the inferior is blessed by the superior. These Levites, in their lineage, they collected these tithes. But think about this man who took it from Abraham. All right. Look at verse 8. It says, in the one case, men who will die receive tithes. But in the other case, Scripture testifies that he lives, right? He lives. And in a sense, Levi himself, who receives these tithes, has paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still within the forefather when Melchizedek met him. All right. So you've got, on the one hand, these Levites who took a tithe, but they live and die. This one, he lives. It's certainly starting to sound more like this Melchizedek is a special character, doesn't it? In fact, go over to verse 22 or 23 of chapter 7, and you'll see that the author of Hebrews is continuing this parallel, and he says in verse 23, now many have become Levitical priests since they are prevented by death from remaining in office. But because he remains forever, he holds his priesthood permanently. Therefore, he is always able to save, talking about Jesus. So what's the difference between the Melchizedek priesthood and the Levitical priesthood? In the Levitical priesthood, you need multiple priests because priests in the Levitical priesthood are men and they tend to die. But this high priest, Jesus, remains forever because he holds his priesthood permanently. That's a distinction between the Melchizedek priesthood and the Levitical priesthood. So if the Melchizedek priesthood, you don't have priests living and dying, what does that tell you about Melchizedek? Seems like it tells you about Melchizedek that he's the same priest. He's always been the high priest. He's still the high priest. And Jesus is like that high priest. How is Jesus like that high priest? Well, Jesus is that high priest. So what are you saying? Are you saying that Jesus is Melchizedek, that we have in Melchizedek a theophany, Jesus showing up in the Old Testament? I certainly believe that because I think that these parallels are too impressive. Now, some would say about this, the response to this is to say, well, hold on a second. I understand he's the King of peace, no beginning of days, no end of days, no genealogy. That priesthood is forever. He was priest forever. Jesus is in that priesthood. He's a priest forever. But it says here in chapter 7, verse 3, that Melchizedek resembled the Son of God, that he was resembling the Son of God. Well, okay, that's true, but remember that Jesus, the Son of God, is a special designation for Jesus after he was born into this world. This is the term that is used for Jesus there. It's not that he wasn't the quote-unquote Son of God, so to speak, prior to that, but Son of God is a term used for Jesus after he came in his earthly manifestation. So like the Son of God isn't a problem. Besides which, we see elsewhere, one like unto the Son of God. This is just not a problem. So I think we have more than a typology here. I think we have Jesus appearing in the Old Testament. And the Melchizedek priesthood has that high priest of Jesus. He is eternal. He is forever. And that's who Melchizedek was and is. Now, I think there's a funny thing I could say about this before we quit. If it's true that he has no beginning of days nor end of days, I was speaking at the Trinity Chapel on the campus of Trinity College and Seminary on one occasion, and I was speaking about the oldest man who ever lived in the Bible, and I meant to say Methuselah. And of course, I know the difference between Methuselah and Melchizedek, but I meant to say Methuselah, but these M names and me just talking, I didn't realize until afterwards. Someone said to me, "You realize you just said Melchizedek was the oldest person in the Bible, the one who had the longest life in the Bible was Melchizedek. You said Melchizedek instead of Methuselah when it's supposed to be Methuselah." And for a moment, I was very embarrassed because obviously I know the difference. I've known since I was a child that Methuselah was the one who has the oldest age, the longest lifespan of anyone in the Bible. But I was about to make a correction with this person and apologize for making a mistake there. But then I realized, if it's true that Melchizedek had no beginning of days nor end of days, well, then who wins between Methuselah and Melchizedek? Who truly is the one with the longest life of anyone else in the Bible? Looks like it's not Methuselah. It's actually Melchizedek. And so I didn't have to apologize. So I would have had no trouble apologizing, but and really, what I intended to say is not what I said. But the truth is, I felt like I found a way to wiggle out of that. So this brings us, because we've already commented on the rest of this chapter, this brings us to the end of chapter 14, and so we have taken both chapters 13 and 14 in this lecture. I hope that it's been a blessing to you.